Good evening, everyone. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. With me is my guest author and activist and national security and domestic security analyst, Trevor Loudon. Trevor is the proprietor of a blog, Trevor Loudon at newszeal.com. And he's also an author of a variety of books that really document rather heavily the links between many prominent Democratic Party politicians and various communist and left-wing dictatorships, Communist Party front groups, and a group that we're going to talk about called Democratic Socialists of America, which has been in the news lately in both the local news and especially the online news. So, Trevor, we're going to be talking about the Hamas's aggression against Israel, the Russia-China connections, and what's going on with DSA, Democratic Socialists America, the Party of Socialism and Liberation. Let's talk about these demonstrations first, because they're making my blood boil, and they're thankfully splitting the Democratic Party, which I'm happy to see. I think we need to have a splintering of the Democratic Party.
Yep. Well, you're right, Nevin. The mask is off. Democratic Socialists of America pretends that they're democratic and that they're only socialists, that they're moderates, and they're full-on communist, and they are fully behind Hamas. And this shouldn't surprise us. You know, they made a resolution a couple of years ago to support the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement against Israel. They went so far as to pull out of the Socialist International because that wasn't extreme enough for them. And now they're part of the Progressive International, which is basically has many communists in its ranks. Yeah, so what we've seen when DSA did a big demonstration in New York in the weekend with Students for Justice for Palestine, with Hamas supporters, with the Party of Socialism and Liberation, which supports North Korea and Cuba and Iran, you know, the mask was completely off. There's no question these people are pro-terrorist communists, but they've got 6 members in the US Congress right now, untold state senators, near majorities on some councils around the country, including Los Angeles, big contingent in Chicago, New York, Minneapolis, etc. So they're a powerful and influential group, and they're supporting some of the worst terrorists on the planet.
Yeah, now DSA has an interesting history, and you and I and other analysts have done the research, you especially, and they started out, I would trace their roots back, and correct me if I'm wrong, to about the early 1970s when there was a split within the Socialist Party of the United States. And you had one wing of Social Democrats. They eventually became Social Democrats USA, which was very critical of China, Cuba, the Soviet Union. And then there was Michael Harrington's faction. Now, Michael Harrington, granted, was critical of Stalin, but he still was not our kind of thoroughgoing anti-communist. And he basically clung to being supportive of Cuba, Nicaragua. He formed the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee in 1982. Now, let's take off from there, from about 1982. Tell us about DSOC, Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, then how it became the Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, was this an organization that was always had very extreme left-wing positions, or were they still relatively social democratic?
Well, the DSOC itself was formed in 1973. In 1982, they amalgamated with the New American Movement, sounds very patriotic, to form what is now known as Democratic Socialists of America. And the old DSOC could make an argument that they were socialist. They had some anti-communists in their rank. A lot of them were very pro-Israel. Quite a large Jewish membership. They were affiliated with the Socialist International, the more moderate wing of the Socialist International. But Harrington took them fully to the left. You know, the old guard was gradually sidelined, and he took them more to the left. And that was completed when they joined with the New American Movement, because the New American Movement was formed out of former members of SDS, the Students of a Democratic Society, and of the Communist Party USA. So that was, these were Gramsciist communists. That's what they were. And they had common ground with DSOC. They amalgamated to form Democratic Socialists of America, and they'd be going further and further left. As the old guard dies out and the new Young Turks take over, they're getting further and further left. And this went into overdrive under, when Bernie Sanders came along. DSA peaked in the early 80s. It had 12,000 members, a lot of influence in the Democratic Party. They worked with people like Ted Kennedy, for instance. They had David Dinkins, the mayor of New York, was one of their key members. He wrecked New York. Giuliani had to come and save it. And so then they started to slowly decline. But when Bernie came along, they went from maybe 6,000 members up to well over 95,000 members. They were pushing for 100. Recent splits have pushed them back to maybe 78, 80,000 members, but they are by far the largest Marxist organization in the country, and they have huge influence in the Democratic Party, huge influence in the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which they helped to found with Bernie Sanders. Yeah, they're a communist organization which can do what they do because they don't openly identify as communists.
Well, don't they have a communist caucus within the DSA?
Oh, they have many. They have the Emerge Caucus, which is communist, the Communist Caucus, which is communist. They've got about 5, there's probably about 10 different caucuses in DSA, 3 or 4 of them which are overtly communist, including, of course, the Communist Caucus. But there's Emerge. There's several. They change and fluctuate all the time. It's hard to keep track. But they've got members of. DSA is not really a party in a way. It's an alliance of a whole lot of other parties, like Communist Party USA. Many of their members are in DSA. Liberation Road, the pro-Chinese communists, same with them. Same with Freedom Road. Same with League of Revolutionaries for a New America. The Socialist Action. You'll find DSA is different wherever you go in the country, depending on the local communist groups on the ground. They all affiliate with DSA. They go along. They take over their local branches. So it's more of an umbrella party than a unified ideological structure.
Yeah. Now, another area of concern is their connections with foreign so-called liberation movements and, quote, anti-imperialist governments. In your study of the DSOC and then DSA, are there any known connections, any actual agents of communist powers that have worked directly in DSA in any capacity, as well as any fellow traveling to totalitarian tyrannies?
Oh, look, many DSAs have made the pilgrimage to Cuba. Many have gone to Venezuela and Nicaragua. They have big ties to those countries. Many of them are very close to PSOL in Brazil, which is a Trotskyist group in Brazil. Glenn Greenwald, the famous pro-Russian commentator that's beloved by Tucker Carlson, his husband is a member of PSOL, of this radical group. So DSA has an international committee, and they are working with Sudanese communists, Greek communists, German communists, French communists, Italian communists, Portuguese, Spanish, South African, Brazilian, Uruguayan, Peruvian communists. They're part of the Communist International. But there's another interesting connection. There's a group based in New York. Well, it's based in Germany, but they have a branch in New York called the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. Now that's named, Stiftung is organization. That's named after the famous German communist revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg. So they have an office in Manhattan, and they work extensively with DSA. They train DSA members. They train Bernie Sanders supporters, Black Lives Matter supporters. That is the wholly owned that organization is based in Berlin, and it is the political, it is wholly owned by Die Linke, which is the major German left-wing party, which used to be the Party of Democratic Socialism, which used to be the East German Communist Party. And so it's still led by some of these old Stasi-loving, Stasi-informing former East German communists. And some of these East German communists have extensive ties to Democratic Socialists of America, training DSA members. So you have DSA being trained by people funded by former East German communists. And they have links to the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, to Black Lives Matter and strikes across America. So these are German agents training DSA comrades, because they are funded by the German taxpayer through Die Linke, the German political party.
Not to mention that Die Linke is also, half of it is intimately tied with the Russians and have
100%.
praised the Russian attack on Ukraine and the occupation of Crimea to the point where elements of Die Linke joined with right-wing populists and neo-fascists in the referendum years ago that took place in Russian-held Crimea. Now, you mentioned the German connection, and one of the things that Trevor had found, and it's available on his blog, KeyWiki, which is a veritable encyclopedia of all kinds of primary source information on all sorts of communist and extreme left-wing personalities and organizations, is a gentleman by the name of Kurt Stand. And you mentioned Stasi.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about Mr. Stand and his connection with East Germany and the DSA?
Well, Kurt Stand was a young American communist based in Milwaukee back in the 1970s. His father had been a communist. His father came from Germany. And in the early 80s, Stan left the Communist Party and was one of the early converts to Democratic Socialists of America. He worked his way up, got onto the National Political Committee of DSA. But in 1997, he was arrested for spying for the Soviet Union and East Germany, recruited by his father, his German communist father. So, and his wife, Teresa Squillicott, was the daughter of a left-wing member of the National Labor Relations Board, and she was working for the Department of Defense at the time, and she was funneling Defense Department documents to Stand, who was passing them on to the East German and Soviet communists. They had another member of their little ring too, a man called Clark, who was a private investigator, also an old communist. All three of them had been in the Communist Party. And so they had this little ring going for several years. They got busted in 1997, and Kurt Stand got sentenced to 19 years in the slammer, which he served the full term, I believe. And as soon as he got out, guess what? DSA let him straight back in. So now he's an active member of the Washington, D.C. Democratic Socialists of America. And they talk about how Stand was incarcerated for fighting for liberty, for being a freedom fighter, persecuted by the United States government for being a freedom fighter, selling military documents to our enemies, but he's a freedom fighter. But this is DSA. They let him back in. But, you know, this is nothing unusual. You know, Bernie Sanders himself, the patron saint of DSA, and I'm sure a member of it, he was mentored by a man called I.F. Stone. I.F. Stone was a well-known, fully paid-up Soviet agent, a journalist in the 30s, who wrote a glowing endorsement letter for Bernie when he first ran for a public office up in Burlington, Vermont. Excuse me, Victoria.
Yeah.
Get some water, please. Sorry, just getting some.
That's okay. That's all right. Take your time.
Yeah. So DSA is communist, you know, but you see right now this is split. You know, this Palestine thing has split them a bit. AOC is not too happy. But Cori Bush and Rashida Tlaib are fully behind the Palestinian thing. But one other member, Mr. Thanadar from Michigan, has actually resigned his DSA membership over this issue.
And there was also a congressman who's a sort of progressive, a left progressive, but with intellectual integrity from the Riverdale section of the Bronx. His name escapes me. He had a very humble background, and he has called out DSA too. And you know, one of the things that helped destroy the Democratic Party, in my opinion, and I'm critical of both, and that's why I'm politically homeless. I take the views that make the most sense to me and that has been the best for moving America forward and increasing our national security and our shared and prosperity. And my critique of the Democrats is they moved away from this sort of patriotic populism that was dominated by the New Deal coalition, which had a lot of patriots at its grassroots level, particularly the American Labor Union movement. And the new politics movement of Senator McGovern took over. And they moved it into a direction that was very hostile towards any strong national military defense. And even after the quote unquote end of the Cold War, that element still continues. And there's too many of them in that particular movement, in the particular Democratic Party. Do you have any comments on that before?
Well, I was talking to a former FBI guy not long ago, and he's saying McGovern was getting more Soviet money than any Democrat had previously. His campaign was awash with Soviet money, and he was the one who really started the big left-wing push inside the Democratic Party and during the Vietnam War era. Of course, he got absolutely slaughtered by Nixon. But, you know, he didn't get anywhere. But the ideas, the McGovern movement, eventually took over the Democratic Party. And Barack Obama accelerated that. You know, Bill Clinton, though I think he's got an extensive communist background himself, was forced by circumstances to move a little bit more to the middle. But, you know, Barack Obama took it on steroids to the left. And Joe Biden, who was sold as a return to the moderate days, has accelerated the trend, you know, that Obama really started. Well, McGovern started it, but accelerated the trend that Obama had amped up. So now we have basically a communist-controlled labor movement in America, which dominates the communist-leaning Democratic Party. So there are no patriotic Democrats left at senior levels. I'm sure your Democratic committeemen in your local neighborhood's just as nice a guy as anyone else. But none of those people get to the leadership positions in the Democrat Party anymore. You know, Manchin is the only one you could say that's some degree of a moderate. And look at the hard time they give him. And if he didn't have that seat in West Virginia, he would have been kicked out of the party a long time ago.
Now, moving to the next political movement, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, they're the other openly communist movement that has been very active in these pro-Hamas demonstrations. throughout the country, even down in Florida. You had PSL active, by the way, in the Tampa demonstrations. We had demonstrations in Fort Lauderdale. And one of the things that concerns me about PSL, obviously, many things concern me, is their hand in these demonstrations, and of course, them being a communist organization. Could you give a little history of the PSL, a little insight on them, please?
Yeah, well, the PSL came out of the Workers' World Party. The Workers' World Party came out of the Socialist Workers' Party of the 1950s. That was and back in the 50s, you really had three main left-wing parties in America. The Socialist Party USA, which was by then in terminal collapse. You had the Socialist Workers' Party, which was Trotskyist, and the Communist Party USA, which was more the Stalinist tradition. And the Trots and the Stalinists hated each other's guts, right? And so, but in the 1959, there was several splits in the Socialist Workers' Party. Trotskyists split all the time. That's what Trots do. They argue over these infinitesimal points, and they split and they curse each other and they throw things at each other and sabotage each other. But anyway, one of these splits was called the Workers' World Party, founded in 59. They were very active in the Vietnam War era. They were sort of a strange blend of Trotskyism and Maoism, which is like combining, strict traditional Catholicism with a holy roller. It's really hard to figure out how they got this together, but they did. And they became very supportive of Russia, supportive of China, North Korea, Cuba, and Iran. But in 2004, there was splits within the Workers' World Party, and the biggest in the split was the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Now, the PSL is probably 10 times the size of the Workers' World Party now. The Workers' World Party just split again into the Communist Workers' League and the Socialist Unity Party. So it's split 3 more ways. So it's they'll probably get a couple of hundred members left. But PSL is everywhere. And they are absolutely pro-Putin's Russia. They are pro-North Korea. They're pro-China. They're pro-Cuba. They're pro-Iran. They're the most extreme and militant communist organization you could think of. And they have had a very strong relationship with the Muslim American Society, Students for Justice in Palestine. Many of them are members of these organizations. They work closely with the Muslim Student Association, etc. The so-called Palestine issue is a huge part of what they do. And now they have branches in virtually every major city in the country, and some not so big, from West Virginia to Colorado to to Florida. They've got several branches in Florida. They've got as many branches as DSA, but they don't tend to have as many people in them. So they're a smaller cadre organization, but they are hardcore. And they work with terrorists. They work with some pretty hardcore people. So yeah, it's very concerning to see them supporting the Hamas cause. Absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, they support the terrorist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and also the anti-American insurgency in Iraq too, as well. So you're absolutely right about that. PSL, they're hardcore. Surprisingly, they won a lot of votes in the last presidential election, particularly in Florida. I was stunned and my jaw dropped when I saw that. So yeah, it's a big deal to me. I mean, I understand their voting patterns, the large cluster of votes in California, Illinois, and I think New York, but Florida, I was like, wow. But I suspect much of that came from supporters in the major cities, particularly Tampa, St. Petersburg, which is a politically very divided city, as well as some other cities in Florida too. So now PSL is involved with that, DSA is involved with that. These are movements that are apologists for China, for Russia, or supportive of them to some degree or another, judging by their statements on Ukraine, where they tend to maybe give Putin a very light slap on the wrist, but they'll.
Well, they don't even do that now.
Oh, they
Those
don't do
the
that now?
Communist Party USA might give Putin a slap on the wrist. DSA might, but PSL, Workers' World Party, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, they're pro-Putin. They make no bones about it.
Oh
They
yeah, Workers' World. Yeah, I seen the Workers' World thing. So they don't even do that. They drop that pretense. And to me, it's a pretense. You just look at what they say. It's just blasting and blaming NATO, Ukraine, and the United States. So we know which side they are. I mean, in your opinion, before we talk about the Russian-Chinese role with Hamas and Hezbollah and other radical Middle Eastern actors, what do you think the motivation for DSA and the PSL for supporting Hamas? Because people will look at the surface and say, well, Hamas, yeah, they're quote anti-imperialist, therefore a totalitarian political and economic system. So yeah, maybe they have some surface similarities with the Marxist-Leninists, but they're both atheists. The communists are at least officially atheistic. These are religious, zealots of the Islamic variety. There's all these differences. What brings them together? What motivates DSA and PSL?
Well, part of it is a straight out anti-Americanism, but they also understand that Hamas is loyal to Moscow. The PFLP is a Marxist-Leninist organization, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, as was the PLO, run by the KGB agent Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas. They also understand that what we call radical Islam is part of the communist movement. That doesn't mean every Muslim radical is a communist, but most of their leaders are. Even the top leaders of Al Qaeda were trained by the Russians. Most of the leaders of Iran, the mullahs, were trained at the Patrice Lumumba school in Moscow. They understand that Kadyrov, the head of the Chechens, who's now using Muslim troops to support Putin's, alleged, attempted conquest of Ukraine. These people are all Marxists, and they understand that the Soviet Union, despite current appearances on foreign policy issues especially, is still 100% part of the world communist movement. So they may not like how Russia is right now. They may not like what's, the sort of Islamist aspects of some of these groups, but they know they're basically comrades in arms. Ultimately, they're on the same side, and the number two enemy is Israel, the little Satan, and number one enemy is the United States. So partly it's common enemies, and partly it's overlapping ideologies that drive these people.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's been a standard with the Soviet Union, really and truly, and a number of these political movements. I mean, Bin Laden, for example, said back in 2003, he said that in the fight against the Crusaders, socialists and Islamists can cooperate. Carlos the Jackal.
Yeah.
Yep, the infamous Ilyich Ramirez Sanchez, who was intimately tied with so many communist countries and Islamist countries like Iran and Sudan. Later, he said in 2003 interview that also Islamists and Marxists should cooperate against the common enemy.
Well, he basically said that capitalism could only be destroyed by an alliance of Islamists and communists.
Exactly.
He was very explicit about it. And this is, all these Islamic terror groups we see, it's like Black Lives Matter. How many Americans understand that Black Lives Matter is a communist, pro-Chinese communist group? I'd say 90% of their supporters don't understand that, if not 95%. Well, most Muslim radicals don't understand that their bosses work for Moscow and Beijing. They're out there, they're willing to die for Allah, but they wouldn't be quite so willing to die for Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. You know, the communists use the Islamic ideology and the natural hatred that Islam has for Judaism, and they amp that up and they boost it up and they train the people and they put agitators in there and they weaponize the natural antipathies of Islam to the West and Christianity and Judaism. And if there's not enough antipathy, they'll boost it up. You know, like right now they've done horrible things in Israel, which is going to provoke a very, very harsh reaction, which will then be used to stoke further hatred towards Israel. You know, when Israel goes in there and wipes out just about all of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, that will just be another example of Zionist brutality.
Of course, and it was just like the Lebanon, if you remember back in 1982-83, this was the first time, and it was somewhat successful, where the Israelis were portrayed. I'm not saying none of us are saying Israel was perfect, but the Israelis went into Lebanon to attack, really basically clean out the PLO state within the state in southern Lebanon, and the international Marxist movements, the communist movement and various fronts that developed, emergency committees on Lebanon and others, Trotskyite as well as hardline Marxist Leninist groups, they were all united into these fronts, mass demonstrations. And in fact, PLO documents that were captured by the IDF, as well as the PLO's own statements, counted on those protests to defeat the Israelis. Why? Because the PLO were counseled by the Soviets, the Romanians, and the North Vietnamese, using the anti-war movement to show the Israelis that, look, we're not terrorists. It's the Israelis that are terrorists, and they're the Goliath, and we're David fighting with the slingshot and the stone.
Well, see, this is what they learned from North Vietnam. You know, this is what they learned from Mao. You know, North Vietnam was a defeated country militarily, but they won the war through the anti-war movement and the treasonous politicians in the United States. That's exactly the same strategy that's being employed by the PLO, by Hamas and others now. We've been forced into these extreme measures by Israeli brutality. We're the minority here. It's all Israel's fault. What we did is regrettable, but we had to do it. They made us do it. You know, and they've learned from Mao Zedong. You know, Mao used to put soldiers in civilian populations. So when the nationalist forces would shell them, they would kill a whole bunch of civilians, which would be a big PR disaster for the nationalists. Well, that's what Hamas does. They put their weapons dumps in hospitals. They put their intelligence groups in schools. They station people in supermarkets, you know, amongst the civilian population. So it's pretty hard to get at them without a little bit of collateral damage. And that collateral damage is the PR material that they use. You know, if you look at Palestine itself, the people who now call themselves Palestinians, they were in Israel. They were never expelled from Israel. They were offered Israeli citizenship. It was the terrorists who told them they had to leave. They made them leave and become stateless people living in Jordan and other countries so they could be a permanent, festering base of homeless, displaced people to be used as cannon fodder, revolutionary fodder, and PR material from then on out. They were not allowed to go and live in Israel. They were never expelled. This myth that they were expelled from Israel is just that. It's a myth. But most people believe it now because of the extensive PR. Look, I joke, and they're all guided by the Russians. I joke there's three main elements in the Earth's atmosphere now. There's nitrogen, there's oxygen, and there's Russian propaganda. It is that pervasive.
It's true. It's so true. You know, I found an interesting quote to kind of buttress what we're saying, and then I want to expand upon this theme. If you don't mind, I'd like to read it to you and the audience. And this is, if it's okay, It was in a book called The War of All the People by John B. Purdue. It's published by Potomac Books in 2012. And he quoted a former senior GRU officer. For those of you in the audience who don't know what the GRU is, it's the Russian Military Intelligence Service. And this GRU officer revealed that, quote, ideological sympathy with the Soviet Union is unnecessary. Anyone who helps destabilize the West is our friend. No one is excluded, even if they are anti-Russian or anti-Soviet. There are no limits on policy or ideological grounds. They are all useful. An Irishman who is anti-British, an Arab who is anti-Jewish, or a Jew who is anti-Arab. The Quebecois wanted to split. That was a Canadian separatist group way back in the 1960s and 70s, for those who are not aware of who they were. They wanted to split Canada. They were bourgeois capitalists who hated Russia, but we liked them. And we see this through history. Starting in 1929, off and on, the Soviets aligned themselves with radical Palestinian Muslims, personalities like the Grand Mufti, Hajj al-Husseini, even supporting the pogroms of 1929 as a necessary revolutionary measure, even though Husseini was not himself a communist. He was a National Socialist type of Islamic collectivist. We know the Soviets have supported the Nazis in their struggle against the Republican governments in Germany in varying stages in the 1920s and early 1930s. We know that the Soviets and fascist Italy had quite a bit of trade relations, up and off and on in the 20s and 30s too. I could list on and on and on and we go. They even supported and traded with the military junta in Argentina from the 70s and 80s because of trade relations and joint anti-imperialist actions over the conflict in the Falkland Islands. It goes on and on. I kind of compare it like you're getting beat up on all sides. The United States, Israel, the Western Alliance, they're the person getting beat up. And the Russians are taking the right fist, the left fist, the feet, and you're getting the crap beat at you at all fronts. The Russians and their allies, in my opinion, they like to throw all kinds of paint on the wall, and they want to see what sticks. They don't care how they achieve it. What are your thoughts on that?
That's exactly right. And this is why in America, most of the so-called alt-right in America is pro-Russian. Much of the libertarian movement is now pro-Russian. Most of the sort of semi-fascist little elements in this country are pro-Russian. And now even many of your mainstream conservatives in this country are leaning in that direction. So the Russians have always had the left. They still have the communist movement on their side, but they also have right-wing parties like Marine Le Pen in France. They have a lot of Orban in Hungary. They have a lot of influence in Greece, for instance, both on the left and the right. So what we've seen now is you've got this convergence going on of the extreme left who are fighting to end the Ukraine war on Russia's terms, allying with the extreme right trying to end the Russian war on Russia's terms. The AfD in Germany, for instance, and also some elements in the GOP here. Marjorie Taylor Greene the other day got herself photoed with Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, one of the most hardcore communists in the country. And this was a fun thing to do. A woman who has backed Venezuela and backed dictatorships all her life, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a so-called conservative Republican. And many of our conservative Republicans have been so gulled by Russian propaganda, they think Russia's our ally and Ukraine's our enemy. The whole thing has been reversed. And what gets me is the people who go and say, we've got to defend Israel because Israel is being attacked by terrorist powers. People are being slaughtered, murdered, tortured, raped. We've got to stand with Israel. But hasn't that been happening in Ukraine for the last year and a half? Yeah, but we can't afford to deal with Ukraine anymore. We've got to focus on Israel. Well, I'm absolutely 100% behind Israel. I've been behind Israel since 1967 when they won the Six-Day War. I was 9 years old. Big Israel fan. But Ukraine is suffering greater attack than Israel by far. And I would argue that they're probably of equal strategic importance, because if Ukraine falls, we're going to have war in Europe, a war like we've never seen, and that will spread to the United States very, very, very quickly. So I see the Ukraine war was the first front in the evil axis striking out. I think Ukraine was the target of the Russians. They wanted to take Ukraine, then they would basically issue an ultimatum to NATO, disband or else. China would have attacked the Pacific. Iran probably would have attacked the Middle East. Rocket Boy might have attacked South Korea. We would have had terrorist incidents across the southern border, and we'd be fighting a five-front war with a traitor in the White House. But the only thing that stopped that is the Ukrainians being so damn tough. And the danger now is that where Netanyahu should have seen Ukraine as his natural ally, he tried to curry favor with Russia, sort of thinking maybe if I'm nice to them, they'll eat us last. Well, unfortunately, Putin has opened a second front here to take pressure off Ukraine, which he was losing badly in. And this is a very critical period we're in right now.
Yeah, it is. And, I want to ask you, and let's discuss, the research that you have done. You've had some excellent Twitter posts that are very informative about this. And you and I and Cliff Kincaid and Jaron Nyquist and our friend, also our mutual friend, Jimmy from Brooklyn, and others have done our work with research and documenting this. The Russians in the 1990s and 2000s, they still have been aligned with Islamic radicals, even Hamas and Hezbollah. Can you elaborate on some of the past as well as current evidence of the Russian and Chinese ties with Hamas and Hezbollah?
Well, look, Hamas has been going to Russia since 2006 at least. They sent delegations there 3 times in the last year. There's been incredible information coming out from the Ukrainian Special Forces operation that Wagner troops were training Hamas in Africa in techniques like dropping drones onto tanks and infiltrating through paragliders and things like this, exactly as they did. The other day a senior Hamas operative said Russia sympathizes with us.
Right.
Colonel Kemp from Britain is a very top NATO officer, is adamant that Russia and Iran are pulling the strings here. Hezbollah, which is a creation of Iran, and Iran is a puppet of Russia. Hezbollah has been working with Hamas for some time. See, this shouldn't happen because Hezbollah are Shia, the Iranian version of Islam, who supposedly hates the Sunni version, who are Hamas. But as I say, the ideology, they are basically communists. They might appear Sunni, they might appear Shia, but basically they are communists. That comes first. So a lot of experts said, we'll never see Hezbollah work with Hamas because Sunnis hate Shias, Shias hate Sunnis. Well, they're doing it, and they have been for some time, because they missed the point. This is the real ideology driving these people is Marxism-Leninism. They just, Black Lives Matter is Marxist-Leninist. The Hamas is essentially Marxist-Leninist. So are the leaders of Iran. This is the point we're missing. We all think communism died, so we never look to the real cause behind these movements and organizations. And every time a coconut, you can trace it back and you'll find Marxist-Leninist roots.
And this is the thing that really gets me, because even if two movements are enemies, but they have very similar goals, they work together. And you kind of jogged my memory. I read this a long time ago, and I came across this statement by the Hamas Sheikh Mahmoud Zahar, and he defined the relationship between the PLO and the Hamas. And back then, they were viewed as absolute enemies, PLO, Al-Fatah, and Hamas. And what he said was, quote, like the wings of a bird, they must work together. What it comes down to is fighting against a common enemy. And they will sort their differences out in when, God forbid, they take over and maybe they might do war with each other. But in the interim, they will work together when need be. And this is what I think a lot of analysts don't understand. I'm sure you're aware of this, Trevor. Iran and Iraq worked together after the first Gulf War of 1990. There was underground trade. Iran helped Iraq smuggle oil out of the country, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was involved with that. I mean, again, old enemies can become new allies, and then become old enemies again, and then allies again. It's crazy,
just like the Colombos and the Gambinis and the mafia mob will fight each other at a certain level, but the bosses will still get together at the top, and then they might have a war and they might have a change of leadership, but then they'll come back together again. Then two of them will gang up against the other one, but they're all part of the mob. While these factions are all part of the Marxist-Leninist movement, and there'll be shifting allegiances and shifting priorities, and they'll betray each other from time to time, but they're still part of the movement. And their number two enemy is Israel. Their number one enemy is the United States. So everything is focused, ultimately, from the drug trade to the alt-right movement in America, to the communists on the streets in New York, to the Chechen troops in Ukraine, to Hamas in Israel, to the CCP troops poised to invade Taiwan, to Kim Il-jong, Rocket, I call him Rocket Boy because I can never remember his name, to Rocket Boy's troops. They are all part of the movement. The evil empire never died. It simply morphed. The Soviet Union never really died. It went into a strategic retreat, but the KGB still stayed in control. Would you say if we defeated Nazi Germany after World War II, but we left the Gestapo in control, would that be a victory? Would that really be a victory? Because the Gestapo are not going to change their spots. While we left when the Soviet Union so-called collapsed, the KGB stayed in control. It used to be the party and the KGB and the army, the three powerful elements in the Soviet Union. Now it's just the KGB. The KGB is more powerful. I know it's got different names, SVR and FSB, whatever, but it's still the KGB. The KGB, as my Slavic friends say. It's still an intelligent state. Its goal has never changed. That's to destroy the West, and they're clearly working with Communist China and Iran to achieve that.
And again, what you're saying makes absolute sense, because it's the tradition of Lenin. What you're talking about, it is true Leninist strategy. Let's share a quote. I know you're familiar with this. Our friend Jimmy from Brooklyn says, go to, and you've done this too, Trevor, Jeff Nyquist, and myself and others have done this, go to the primary sources. So Lenin said in his Selected Works, Volume 10, International Publishers, 1943, which was the Soviet publishing house at the time, and Lenin wrote that, quote, the strictest loyalty to the ideas of communism must be combined with the ability to make all the necessary practical compromises, to tack, to make agreements, zigzags, retreats, and so on, in order to accelerate the coming into power. That explains Russian/Soviet/Chinese/communist politics to a T. and Islamist politics. I remember when I was younger following the news when Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died in 1989, and you had Ali Akbar Rafsanjani take over, a corrupt mullah who was tied with the corrupt dealings in, I think, Mitsubishi's and pistachio trade and everything else of the Bonyads, which is these huge, massive parastatal Islamic foundations. And he was hailed as a reformer, and there was talk about, moderates and hardliners in Iran and everything, but really they do the same tack. I remember reading in Midstream magazine, there was a diplomat who was resident in Tehran. He said, you know what the difference between an Iranian hardliner and a moderate is? A moderate is an Iranian moderate is those who run out of hard currency and need more of it. And that's what it comes down to. That's what it comes down to. It's, it's the same. I don't want to use profanity. It's the same stuff, but a different era, a different decade.
Well, that's right. And this is what we're going to look at with Putin right now. A lot of people think Putin's a problem. Putin only serves at the pleasure of the intelligence services, the Soloviki, the elite of the intelligence services. He's doing what they tell him to do. If Putin dies of cancer or goes away, the policy will only change when they want a change. It's very convenient to blame any disaster on Putin. This is Putin being crazy. But Putin is a puppet. Every Soviet leader since Stalin has been chosen by the inner circle to represent a certain policy. And so that may be, Andropov in the early 80s was sold as this great reformer. He was a jazz loving, whiskey drinking, hip, cool guy, and he was going to lead this great reform. But he died of kidney disease. So they had to put Chernenko in, the old Stalinist, until they could train up Gorbachev to do what Andropov was supposed to do, glasnost and this kind of thing. And this was told to me by a friend of mine who trained at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning in Moscow in 1983. They were told the history of this, that Gorbachev was there to do this big opening to the West, which would bring in tons of capital, would get the West to disarm, and it would be a preparation for destroying the West once and for all. And that is backed up, as you know, by reading Golitsyn, Anatoly Golitsyn. He laid out the Soviet plans, writing in the early 80s before anyone had heard of Gorbachev. So we got to understand the Soviets, the Chinese. There's a famous story, and it's probably not even true, but it illustrates the point. Somebody asked Mao Zedong, "What's your opinion of the French Revolution?" He said, "Well, it's too early to tell." They think in terms of hundreds of years. They think in terms of epochs. We think in terms of election cycles. So no wonder they're able to out-strategize us. We're just going from impulse to impulse. No strategic planning. That's all they do. Yeah. And they'll devote 50 years to a project if they have to.
I mean, what I would do, honestly, if I were in the CCP Politburo and in the United Russia Party and the secret structures in the Russian Federation that are of at least the Soviet culture, is this. I would immediately do a Treaty of Brest-Litovsk retreat so Russia can do another perestroika. And I think this going to happen possibly in the next 5 or 10 years. By the time my daughter is out of college, there's probably going to be a perestroika in both countries because they're going to have to retrench. They're going to realize that they're not fully prepared to do what they will ultimately seek to do in gaining world hegemony. And they're going to do a Treaty Brest-Litovsk. For those of you in the audience that is not familiar, that is a treaty that was signed with the Germans that Lenin and Trotsky negotiated with the Germans, which ceded many, many privileges and rights to the Germans territorially and economically. but they needed breathing space. Gorbachev mentioned that in a speech to Novosti and other propaganda workers in 1987, which was very little reported other than a few conservative journals like National Review at the time. And he talked about what he was doing was a sort of treaty Brest-Litovsk. We have a lot to learn. The Russians were able to retrench, fight their enemies off in the Civil War, and then they were able to launch NEP, get all the big business and capitalists in for concessions and trade agreements and all the rest of it, and build up their economy and build up their international legitimacy again. And I think this is where potentially Putin miscalculated. I mean, I am not sure about, I'm not one of these people that underestimates the Russians. American intelligence in the past, we have had a bad habit of underestimating Russian military potential and their technological capabilities. So I'm very leery about that. The book by Edward J. Epstein, Deception, outlined that history. So I am more, I guess, I say, of an alarmist. I sympathize with Ukrainian sovereignty, no doubt about it. But on the fence on, both sides are self-serving in the sense they want to say they're victorious. I just get very leery when I hear that, oh, the Russians are total screw-ups and everything else. Yes, they have their command and control major issues. That's one of their Achilles heels. Like any extreme statist, quasi-socialist economy like what they have, they don't have a capitalist economy as I would define as highly state-controlled. And there's a tremendous amount of lack of accountability and corruption built into that. There's no doubt about it. But whatever the case may be, they are doing two things. They're trying to bleed NATO and the Ukrainians as much as they can, wait for the elections, as we've talked about. Jeff and I have talked about it too. And they're going to try and also launch a new perestroika, both Beijing and Moscow, to give a new face. And guess what? We're going to sign a peace treaty, and maybe we'll give up all of Ukraine so we could retreat back, but we're going to retrench, and then we might be in another 10 years back, badder than ever. What are your thoughts about that? Am I crazy?
Well, I think it's optimistic. I hope we've got that long. I hope they're going to go for another retrenchment. I think if it hadn't been for Ukraine fighting back, we'd already be in World War III now. I think this would be the closed fist. But it's gone badly for them. China has hesitated to attack Taiwan. They were mobilizing to do so. They've pulled back. China has major economic problems. So you may be right. That would be the best case scenario here, that we hold them so, we stop them so badly that they have to do another retreat, another stage retreat. And they'll do that if they have to. They think in terms of hundreds of years. But also, I think if we are weak now, they might just go for the final push. They might just think, well, we should have done it back in the 80s. We didn't do it then. We've got Biden in the White House. We know he's not going to be up to much. He's our man. Let's do it now. I think there's two competing schools of thought here. Let's bide our time again. We've made huge progress. But we've seen where our mistakes lie. We've seen our shortcomings. Let's go back and re-examine things. How do we get more Western investment? How do we rebuild our image on the public stage? All of that. How do we get the moral high ground back? Maybe. There's two ways of going forward here. And I'm not sure which way it's going to be. I think a lot of that depends on what we do. If we're strong, I think we'll force them into a retreat. But if we give up now and we start, if the Republicans defund Ukraine, I think they might just go hell for leather.
Yeah, and I agree. Ukraine has put up a fight that really caught me by surprise, at least initially, because I thought it was going to collapse. And I'm thankful that that country is still alive, frankly. And I sympathize with their cause, because I agree with you. If Ukraine falls, that's going to could change. That really could change the European balance of power and perhaps the world balance of power. Because as I like to remind our listeners, in 2020, Dmitry Medvedev, vice president at that time of the Russian National Security Council, Putin's vice president and president of Russia when Putin was prime minister, off and on, he said that the goal of war in Ukraine is to build a Eurasian Europe from Vladivostok to Lisbon. It's basically a neutralized, if not allied, Russia, and that's what they want. And that has devastating implications in the United States. And the Middle East plays a role in this too as well, particularly with our oil imports. And vital shipping lanes. So you got the Suez Canal, Straits of Hormuz, and the Persian Gulf. And we have some very, very serious issues. We know that China has funded Hamas through branch banks in Israel, and that money, Chinese money, was used for terror attacks in 2006 against American Israeli Jews. A very controversial situation. And then on top of that, we also know that the Russians, as we've talked about, have had their hand on Hamas. Hamas, even under Yeltsin, Hamas and Hezbollah, according to former GRU Colonel Stanislav Lunev, the Russians viewed Hamas and Hezbollah as legitimate political organizations, and that continued under Putin. We know, according to an article from Midstream magazine from the year 2000, then they footnote their articles. I mean, yes, they're right-wing Zionists, but they had argued even under the Palestine Authority governments of Arafat that the Russian Federation continued to arm and train the so-called police force of the Palestine PLO Al-Fatah Authority government. So they still have a hand in Palestinian terrorism. There's no doubt about it. And as you pointed out, and you posted on your Twitter, that Hamas leadership are saying that the Russians are behind us. We know that Hamas has said, you know, we support the Russians in their aggression against Ukraine. In fact, I think the Hamas leader, correct me if I'm wrong, even said they hope they bomb Britain or something or another while they're at it.
Something went wrong.
Correct.
Please try again.
Correct me if I'm wrong. That was my phone, Siri going off. It sometimes does that. Sorry, audience, and sorry, Trevor. So
yeah,
didn't
this is the evil empire. You know, it never went away. It was never defeated. And if evil empires aren't defeated, they come back. And we either acknowledge that and deal with it, or we eventually succumb. There's not going to be another path here.
So true. Do you have any closing comments? Because we are about an hour in, and any closing comments, any suggestions on how America should proceed before we sign off?
Well, what I'd say what the Republicans need to do is they need, look, there was a letter written by two senior Republicans, Senator Risch and McCall of Texas, and they wrote it to Biden. They said three main things. They said, Biden, where is the plan for ending the war in Ukraine? What is the goal? What does victory look like? The second thing they said is, why are you slow walking everything? Why are the Ukrainians still don't have fighter jets 18 months in? Why are they fighting ground battles with no air cover? Why have you been slow on everything? And third, is it true that there have been reports that you're having secret meetings with Russia behind the scenes without Ukrainian participation, and that you've been ensuring the Russians that we do not intend for regime change in Russia or to diminish Russia as a power? Okay, so this is the Biden administration. So the Republicans shouldn't be going, let's pull out of Ukraine, let's pull out of Ukraine. They should be showing, let's have a plan. Let's give Ukraine what we promised them when they gave up all their nuclear weapons back to Russia, and we promised to protect them. Let's honor the promise. Let's win the war. Let's get Putin deposed. Let's get a regime change in Russia, give the Russians a chance for freedom, and win this. That would be the winning message. Look, one little other thing I'll say, I've just been up in Pennsylvania, and there's Russian Orthodox churches everywhere, Ukrainian flags everywhere. The whole area is Coes, and it's all Ukrainians and Balts and Romanians and Czechs, and these were conservative Democrats, Pennsylvania and Ohio. Trump made them Republicans. They're going back to Biden because Biden is defending Ukraine, or so they believe, and the Republicans want to defund them. These are critical states. Republicans do not understand the trap they're being led into. Biden is stringing on Ukraine, giving them just enough to fight, but not enough to win. And if the Ukrainians win, he will take full credit. And the Republicans will look like idiots. And if the Ukrainians lose and there's a mass slaughter or even a war, major war out of it, he can blame the Republicans for that, and the Democrats coast to another victory.
Yeah, I mean, and I am concerned. I recently see a clip here that I was looking on my phone as you were talking, making some very good points, some of which I was not aware of. And John Kirby, who is the White House spokesman under the Biden administration, had said recently, you can't start planning for long-term support if you're at the end of your rope. And in financing Ukraine, we're coming to the end of the rope. Today, we announced $200 million, and we will continue to help Ukraine as much as we can, but it will not be indefinite. So I see the shades of the so-called anti-war people, because they're not really anti-war, in Congress. And then you have joining hands, just like with Nixon. Now we have Biden potentially now going to scale support back to Ukraine.
To snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
Exactly.
Like we did in Vietnam. When Vietnam was virtually won, America blinked. The North Vietnamese had a couple of twos. America had 3 aces, and they bluffed us into folding. Well, that's the same position today. We could win this if the Ukrainians had the help they needed and the clear direction and the firm commitment that this war has to end on Ukrainian terms. They would win it. And Putin would probably be deposed, and we'd have a chance of a much better future. But because of the Russian propaganda and the influence it's had on many of these Republicans, they could lead us into a disastrous defeat right when we're on the verge of winning things.
Well, on that note, I agree. We need, the support, the battles in Ukraine, in Israel. They're inexorably linked. If those countries get delegitimized or even destroyed, I believe that will start a chain reaction that will negatively affect the balance of power in the world. And that's why, look, no country is perfect, but you say this to the audience, trust me, world dominated by Russia and China and their allies throughout the world, it's going to be a hellscape. You want to think of one big gigantic concentration camp, that's what it's going to be.
North Korea with American surveillance technology worldwide.
Yes, exactly. It's what's going to happen. And you're going to have the worst elements coming to power. Corrupt, totalitarian, murderous, kleptocrats. I haven't met too many of any top communist leaders, but people like you and J.R. Nyquist have. And what I know is through academic research, through defectors, and these are just truly evil, brilliant people, but truly evil individuals, and they're very clever. And I frankly fear them. I fear them very much. I respect them as a formidable enemy, but do I respect them as human beings, as kind, decent, regular human beings? No. And that's why they need to be contained. And if strategically feasible or possible, if we can do it, evicted from power if need be. So
we got to treat them like organized criminals. We don't leave the mafia in power. If we can get rid of the mafia don, we do it. If we can get them out of our city, we do it. And that's what we need to do with the world. We need to do what Reagan attempted, which was to end the evil empire. We need to finish Reagan's job to drive them out of power for 500 years. Seriously end their movement. That's what we should have on our agenda. I'm sick of this containment.
Yeah.
Sick of this half measures. Finish the damn job. We owe it to our kids.
And that we have to decouple ourselves too. And it's going to be a very long process, but we need to decouple from them, because if they don't have the trade, they don't have the political legitimacy in Western capitals through the extreme left, as well as various shades of the right and the business community and whatnot. They don't have massive diplomatic presences in the free countries. Once that's also rolled back and we restore our power, even internally and domestically, we will be a lot better off. And then we would be in a position to roll them back. Because ultimately that's what has to happen.
Yeah,
I agree. I think the United States still has their strengths, but whether we like to admit it or not, we have tremendous weaknesses. And that needs to be addressed. I certainly have my own ideas. I mean, I wrote a whole book off and on talking about how to achieve that. But anyways, this has been a great show. Trevor, love to have you back on in the future. Would you be willing to come back a third time on that?
Yeah, of course I will, and I'll get you on my show too soon, Nevin. So, yeah, we'll do it.
All righty. Well, everyone, just make sure everyone follow the news, pray hard, hope for the best, appreciate what you have, and make sure you study your candidates very carefully with who you vote for on a variety of issues. Keep yourself informed. Trevor, where can people find your print works and your online works, please, before we go?
Yeah, just go to trevorloudon.com. My book's there. I have a shop there. I've got a couple of DVDs, Enemies Within, about the Marxists in Congress, Enemies Within the Church, which is obvious, security risk senators, out profiling 30 currently serving subversive US senators, House Un-Americans, my new series profiling 100 currently serving Congress members. So all there, easy to get, trevorloudon.com.
All righty. Awesome. All righty. Thank you so much, Trevor. Your wealth of knowledge, great analysis of world events as usual, as well as the domestic national security threats. I did not know that about George McGovern. I've heard rumors that he took Soviet money. If we had more time, I wanted you to elaborate on that, because that is just fascinating. But not surprising. Nothing surprises me anymore about that. So, thank you again. Be sure to check out Trevor's works. Thank you all. God bless America. And everybody out there, whether you're in Israel, United States, or Ukraine, just be safe. God bless.
Thank you, Nevin.
You're welcome.